Global Education Forum, housed here in the School of Education, Teaching, and Health at American University, is a very valuable component to our work in trying to understand how communities come together, and a very valuable piece of the part of the process that we here at American really focus on, and that is thinking about creating spaces where debate and attention to the major issues of the day can come into play. The forum itself is a space where we have the opportunity to create conversations about global pressing issues. This weekend, the Global Education Forum will focus on issues of right-wing extremism, and unfortunately, that's a very pressing and pertinent issue for us to be discussing. So I do thank our speakers this week, or this weekend, to thank each of you for coming out from all over the world to come and share your expertise. And I also thank each of you for coming out tonight to spend some time talking about this very powerful issue. So thanks to each of you for coming. And also, you don't always get a chance to take a moment when these events sort of happen. Of course, you're all here for the focus, but I do want to take a minute to thank everyone who had something to do with putting this event together. So Cynthia, Ophira, thank you both for putting together yet another lovely event, and I hope we'll look forward to yet another great program coming up in November. I also have the really wonderful opportunity to introduce my good friend and colleague, Ilana Lancaster, who will be serving as the moderator for the event today. You have a biography about Ilana in the beautiful little Global Ed Forum document. So if it's okay, I'll go a little off script and say that Ilana is a really amazing teacher. She's taught me quite a bit about the issues that are pertinent to both international and domestic education. She's a fantastic person who lives critical race theory, has really brought things to my own attention, and I'm certain that her work tonight in terms of moderating this discussion will be powerful and informative. So thank you, Ilana, for your work tonight, and again, thanks to each of our speakers. And I'll turn it over to Ilana, or would you like to say a few words?
Well, I'm very excited to be here. I'm actually a little bit nervous, which surprises me. I think I'm nervous because I look out and I see most of my students sitting here in the corner, and my colleagues, of course. But I have the good fortune to moderate this session this evening. And so I want to begin by telling you a little bit about how the forum is going to unfold. So I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists. They will speak for about 15 minutes. And then afterwards, each of our 4 panelists will speak for about 15 minutes. And then afterwards, I'll try to offer some synthesis, comments, and then we really wanted to open it up to the floor, because the idea behind the forum is that this is really a conversation. And as Sarah mentioned earlier, this is such a relevant and pertinent topic for conversation, so we really want to open it up and have an engaged conversation dialogue. So I'm going to begin, and forgive me if I mispronounce your names. I was looking at this now. So Heidi Birich? Byrick already. Not so good. I'm really excited to welcome Heidi. You can see the bios are in detail, but just a comment that Heidi is the director for the Intelligence Project at the Southern Poverty Law Center. That is Heidi. Again, you can review the bio. I really want to kind of move through this quickly so we can just have time for the conversation. We also would like to welcome Alexandra Cornell. Sorry, thank you very much for the assistance. And she is a professor of sociology at Pantheon University. Yeah, okay. Of social and political sciences in Greece. We have Martin Langbach. Okay, and Martin is a sociologist, and he's a program manager for the General Federal Agency for Civic Education. And lastly is our colleague here in the School for International Service, Susan Shepler, and her research interests cover youth in conflict and reintegration of former child soldiers, post-conflict reconstruction, etc. So I'd like to give the floor over to Heidi to begin with, and I'm a ruthless timekeeper.
Well, I'm really happy to be here at American University. Thanks for inviting me, Cynthia. This is really nice. I, unlike most of the folks who are speaking, am not an academic. I work for an advocacy organization. I don't know how many people have heard of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Few? Okay, I run the part of the law center that tracks hate groups, right? So every year we put out this list of extremist groups across the United States. So when I think about education and extremism, I think about it basically on on two levels. First, let me just set a little groundwork. The number of hate groups in the United States has been steadily rising basically since 2000. This is largely the result of changing demographics here in the United States. Whites will become a minority in 2040 something. The census keeps shifting that number. But in the year 2000, the census for the first time said, hey, to the United States, we are going to have this massive demographic shift happen in 40 some years. And as a result of that, white supremacists basically lost it. I mean, obviously, if you want the country to be run by white people and pretty soon whites are going to be the minority, you're kind of a lost cause. So what we saw starting in 2000, and then it spiked again, of course, when our first black president was elected, was a steady rise in the number of these groups. So there's been a little bit of a fall in the last 2 years, but there are more hate groups today by a long shot than there were in 2000 and far more than there were in the 1990s. I think our latest count is 738 groups. At the same time that those numbers have been rising, so those are like your neo-Nazis, your Klansmen, and other forms of white supremacy for the most part, also anti-immigrant groups, anti-Muslim groups, groups that deny the Holocaust. There's also a whole other sector of extremism in the United States of people who are virulently anti-government. And when I say that, I don't mean that they want smaller taxes. These are people who think Obama's coming to round them up, take their guns and put them in like concentration camps, that kind of crazy thinking. The numbers of those groups have exploded as well. So we're basically talking about 2,000 to 3,000 organized extremist groups across the United States. Those are numbers that have never been that high. So when I was asked to discuss education and extremism, I basically thought about this on three levels. One, most of the people who end up sucked into, say, skinhead or neo-Nazi groups, I'm talking about young folks, those groups tend to be young, are people for whom the educational system has completely failed them. They're people who, we talk a lot of times to people who leave the movement. So they've been a neo-Nazi skinhead and something has happened to them, something positive, so they quit the movement. And, almost all of them are dropouts from high school. This doesn't mean that they're stupid or ignorant. They are people who, for some reason, the educational system failed them. Most of the times their families have had, faced some sort of catastrophe. In some ways, you can look at neo-Nazism and skinheads as the equivalent of a gang, right? But it's like a white gang as opposed to maybe a Latino gang or something else. Their families have failed them, and when they become educated into hatred. That's what they end up doing. I think it's a fair statement to say that your average, racist, professional racist is probably more well-read than the average American, because that's where they get this stuff, whether it's online or in books. So that was my first thought about education, that there is just a wholesale collapse at sort of the middle school and the high school level when it comes to these issues. Of course, there could be a lot of criticisms made of public schooling in general on this front, failing students of all kinds, but that's usually what happens to them. If a student with these beliefs makes it into the university, for the most part, they hide their views. There's a lot of people who are extremists who talk about not being willing. They believe there's a PC tyranny on campus, essentially, and that they are excluded from campus life. And most of them, if they're going to get a degree, go to school, keep their heads down, get through, and don't disclose their views until afterwards. They're pretty few and far between, and they basically feel that they're in a hostile environment for those who talk about it, and there aren't a whole lot. And most of them don't go any further in the educational field than that. We've had some notable examples in the last couple of years, though, of colleges having been an extremely positive place that turns people's views around. And I'm thinking in particular of a kid named Derek Black, who is the son of one of the most famous hate mongers in the United States, a man named Don Black, who runs the oldest and the largest hate site on the web, this website called stormfront.org. It's a really ugly place, but it has 300,000 registered users. And Derek was brought up by his parents to be a professional racist. In other words, from the time he was this big, he was taken on a racist circuit from event to event to event, and he ended up running like I don't remember what it was called, but it was like a cartoon site on Stormfront for kids to get inculcated into the hate movement. And for Derek, the attending New College in Florida changed everything in his life. And he actually ended up renouncing his father's views and renouncing the hate movement and incredibly coming out for things like gay marriage, which were a million miles from where he'd been before. Unfortunately, other than one letter he wrote in which he talked about the community at New College down there in Sarasota, Florida, having been supportive, he will not talk on the record. He has now become an object of curiosity for the press and an object of ridicule for the movement in which his father is such an important part. So it shows you how hard it can be to walk away from these things. So that's sort of what I know from the student end of things. There's another part of academia that has in the past been a serious problem, and it has usually been in the sciences. And there have been, I would say, about a dozen or more professors across the United States who have used the academic freedom that they gained through tenure to pursue studies based on about biological racism. Essentially genetic or psychological research that exists to prove that minorities are inferior to white people. And in fact, the whole thinking of eugenics, right, the whole concept of eugenics was created in American universities at the beginning of the 1900s and propagated by American scientists and funded by an American institution called the Pioneer Fund that was founded in the 1930s. And the handful of people who still receive Pioneer Fund grants are continuing that work in our university system. This is extremely important because eugenics didn't go from Hitler to the United States. It went from the United States to Hitler. And the Pioneer Fund, this outfit that still exists and has its headquarters in New York and is headed now by a British race scientist, has been giving money to these people since the 1930s. In fact, the two founders of the Pioneer Fund got an award from Hitler in the 1930s. So that gives you a sense about this. So there's a woman named Linda Gottfredson who's at, I believe, the University of Delaware, if I've got it right, who continues to do this genetic research. There's a guy at the University of Arizona who does this kind of race science research. There is a person, I'm not sure if he's retired or not, a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and there are professors around the world, including the head of the Pioneer Fund now, a guy named Richard Lynn, who kind of runs his own outfit, who is doing this kind of work. The former head of the Pioneer Fund was a man named Philippe Rushton, and he was a professor at the University of Western Ontario. He died a few years ago, and he did some of the most, I would say, disgusting research on these topics. I don't even want to talk about them in polite company, but essentially he was trying to prove that minorities have smaller brain size and larger other things. And that was the symbol of sort of their inferiority. The science was BS basically and backwards. But he was able to eke out an existence at the University of Western Ontario and actually teach classes with students in them who were not aware of his views. There are fewer and fewer of these kinds of people. However, that guy, Philippe Rushton's brother, teaches at a university in Florida, I believe in the education department today, and he's still on the board of the Pioneer Fund. So if you don't spend a lot of time digging through their tax records, you don't even realize some of the connections that are there. But I want to talk about one person who I think has been the most problematic person in terms of spreading anti-Semitism in the U.S., and he did it from a post at Cal State Long Beach out in California. And his name is Dr. Kevin McDonald. And he was in the psychology department there. He retired last year. And he wrote a 3-volume set of books that were published by Prager, a legitimate mainstream press. It somehow got through every peer review process. He got through his tenure review, everything. And the thesis of his books, the thesis that he put out and that the tenure review committee said okay to from his department, was this: that Jews are genetically and unconsciously driven to undermine white society by doing things like flooding white countries with minorities, thereby eliminating white power. That Jews are genetically driven to manipulate university systems. So they will do things to get their people in there and make other people not be able to get educated. I would say since Mein Kampf, the 3 books that Dr. Kevin McDonald put out are probably the biggest push for additional anti-Semitism in the world, period. They've been translated into multiple languages. Prager luckily doesn't reprint them anymore. But they are now all over the place, and they are really the standard that people read to know why they should have to hate, why they should fear and hate Jews today. It turns out David Duke, who most of you have probably heard of, the former Klansman who ran for president at one point, he cribbed off of McDonald's works for his own book that he wrote about Jewish supremacism. Kevin McDonald did all of this while teaching minority students and Jewish students this kind of material, and nobody at the university catching it ever. He did all this when he had faculty members who knew what he was up to and refused to confront him. And it took advocacy work by the place that I work at, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and some other folks at like the Anti-Defamation League and student groups to even get fellow faculty members at Cal State Long Beach to denounce this absolute anti-Semitic drivel. So what happened at Cal State Long, and they eventually did, several departments eventually did denounce him. He was taken out of undergraduate teaching, but it was a long, hard fight. It took basically 5 or 6 or 7 years to get the university to turn around. So what that experience showed me is that there can sometimes be a certain amount of cowardice and conservatism in administrations about addressing these kinds of issues. And people, being what they are, don't like to make a stink. And in this case, the not making a stink allowed a guy to walk around with a PhD and a professorial position and propagate some of the most vile hate that's out there. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, over the years, universities have been handmaidens of the propagation of hate. They have been funders and protectors of scientific experiments that should never have happened and that just existed to basically keep white supremacy in place. But in general, the recent trend has been that people like McDonald don't get to stay in place, don't get to make it through tenure. And sometimes universities become, enlightening places for students like Derek Black to come and change their views. And I think the Derek Black story tells you something about, I think, a school that is seen as largely liberal, New College, liberal arts, so politically liberal arts, that sometimes if you embrace these people and make a home from them, they can sort of leave that past behind. So those are my thoughts, and I'll leave it at there.
So this is the first time I am in the United States, and I am very happy for this. So excuse me for my English. I speak French better than English, so sometimes be patient with me. But I would like to thank the School of Education, Teaching and Health of American University, but especially Cynthia Miller-Idris for this invitation. So in my presentation, I will try to discuss with you the ways that the mainstream educational system, as well as formal and informal types of learning and lifelong learning, could contribute in the confrontation of fascism, racism, and xenophobia. My starting point is the extreme violent activism of the political party, maybe you know this party in Greece, named Golden Dawn, that this is a very violent neo-Nazi political party, which after the elections of January 2015, yes, in Greece, it remains the third political power in the Greek parliament. The presence and activism of this party in Greece and of similar parties in Europe in general, for example in France or in Hungary, as well as other extremist activities like the recent terrorist attack at the offices of Charlie Hebdo in Paris are phenomena that are challenging, in my opinion, the European structure and its democratic principles and values. Let me say a few words about the activism of Golden Dawn. I must say that this is a particular situation now in Greece because since 2010, Greece has been experiencing an economic and social collapse which has been strongly felt in all aspects of social and political life. These circumstances were crystallized in the outcome of the national elections in 2012, then in the local and European elections of 2014, and finally the national elections of 2015, in which the dominant two-party system was severely challenged by the impressive electoral success of the left coalition named Syriza that became the government in Greece in January 2014. Despite all this, and despite the fact that Golden Dawn now is accused as a criminal organization in Greece, and many of their members of the parliament are in the prison waiting for a trial, we must say that GD remains a very active party, a violent and racist neo-Nazi movement, and its discourse combines cultural and biological racism. Golden Dawn speech is xenophobic, since it insists on the idea that immigrants living in Greece undermine national cohesion, homogeneity, and cultural identity. For Golden Dawn's youth division, for example, the mixture of races is unacceptable, since it almost always leads to abnormality and mental illness. Moreover, I must say that Golden Dawn systematically refuses the historical reality of Holocaust, and there are some members of the parliament that identify themselves publicly as Holocaust deniers, activating the neo-Nazi discourse set of arguments that is typical for this purpose. Within this context, I must say that Golden Dawns pays in particular attention on young people. Youth is considered as the party's driving force. It is identified as the vanguard of national revolution in order to establish a new nation. So you can see here some, for example, Golden Dawn is very active in schools, even in the elementary school, where there are groups of school students that appear to openly express their support for Golden Dawn, displaying the party symbols, for example, swastikas and the neo-Nazi salute, intimidating and attacking political opponents, teachers, and classmates of non-Greek origin, and recruiting fellow students. The situation in Greece quickly took the form of a fierce antagonism and conflict between groups supporting Golden Dawn and anti-fascist groups that were formed in reaction to the party's aggressive presence in schools. So you can see here. In this context also, Golden Dawn organized lessons, historical lessons as they say, for the nationalist education of young people, even at primary level. Golden Dawn's public activities reveal that young people are involved in much of its social activism, particularly in food and blood donation, but for only for Greeks only, and in public events and commemorations. Moreover, Golden Dawn encourages racist violent attacks against immigrants as a kind of initiation rite ritual to the party's political practice, an accusation that Golden Dawn officially rejects. So you can see here, for example, here are some classes with history lessons, and you can see here very young pupils that they use the neo-Nazi salute. Groups also of Golden Dawn supporters, especially young men, take part in camps where they practice military training, shooting, gymnastics, long-distance running, boxing, and winter survival skills. Here is from in Thermopylae. I must say that they prefer, when they talk about the ancient Greece and they use a lot the mythology, they are always for the ancient Sparta that had an oligarchic system and not for the democratic Athens, for example. And here you can see some persons with the salutation, or the Nazi salutation, in youth festivals. And here we have some also. Also, the party organizes open gatherings, speeches, and rallies, which give the leadership of the party the opportunity to promote its agenda, to fanaticize its supporters, and attract the attention of new audiences. These open gatherings and speeches often take the form of rituals, lighted torches in the night, singing of anthems, arrival of supporters in military style. So this is in this context that as a social scientist and also as a professor at the university, at Pantheon University, but also at the Open University in Greece, many times me and some other colleagues of me, we have wondered many times about the possible ways to confront, that we have to confront fascism, racism, xenophobia, and the stereotypes that accompany them, but mainly about the ways we can prevent such phenomena, not only among young people, but also in the general population. It is true that nowadays, both in Europe and the United States, many measures are implemented on this issue, on the national as well on the local level. My view and my experience is that education is a very fruitful way to fight and especially to prevent those kinds of phenomena. Without considering that education can resolve all the problems, I strongly contend that this is the most effective way in order to empower the transmission of democratic values and fight social stereotypes and prejudice that lead to fascism, to fascist attitudes and racist conduct. But I have to talk how this is something also about. But for me, the most important is how and which are the appropriate educational tools that we can use for an activity to combat fascism, racism, and xenophobia. I will try to transfer to you my experience from the implementation of the principles of what is named transformative learning in my classes. So for the theory, maybe you know this theory of transformative learning, use two concepts, two very important concepts that were defined within the theoretical framework of Jacques Mezirow. You can read here what means for him reflection and critical reflection. Concerning this theoretical approach of transforming learning, we must say that the first was Paulo Freire, was the first scholar of adult education who profoundly developed the concept of critical consciousness. Later, Mezirow developed the theory of transformative learning, which he defined as the process by which we transform problematic frames of reference, sets of assumptions and expectations, to make them more inclusive, discriminating, open, reflective, and emotionally able to change. Based so on these principles, I often ask my students to work in groups on media material derived from the television, the cinema, the movies, and historical documents, as well as from theater, poetry, literature, painting, photograph, dance, and music. This method is called learning through art. And me and some other colleagues in Athens, we have tried to work with this method, more specifically on the issue of fascism, with the starting point of the activism of Golden Dawn. I have used 3 movies working with my students, but also Greek and foreign poetry. The films we work with the students were certainly, you know these films, certainly the first one, at least, the American History X. The second film was The Wave, a German film, and the third film was a film named With Heart and Soul by Pantelis Vulgaris. That is a film about the the Greek Civil War after the occupation of Germans in 1944. So while examining the spirit of the artworks, the discussion considered the stereotypical conceptions and behaviors about the issues of fascism, racism, and xenophobia. Alternative points of view have been raised, and participants discussed the possibility of developing an alternative conception of everyday reality. For these reasons, in my opinion, the aesthetic experience is wider and deeper than the usual experiences from reality, and it constitutes an important challenge for thought. Similar ideas were formulated, of course, in the first decades of the 20th century by Adorno and Horkheimer, the named Frankfurt School, later by Herbert Marcuse, who in his book, The Aesthetic Dimension, supported that contact with the arts masterpieces makes possible the inversion of the established experience and regenerates the desire for human liberation. In sum, we could say that the scholars of the Frankfurt School formulated a sum of ideas that demonstrate the emergence of critical dimension of aesthetic experience. They also analyzed the process through which our contact with these works undermines the order of social stability and activates critical thinking. Two other leading readers for me in their essays dealt with the relation between the literary creation and the reader. Marcel Proust, the French writer, in his autobiographic text Days of Reading in 1905, described how reading literature activated his imagination and allowed him to perceive himself in different ways and discover areas of his inner life. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, in his essay What is Literature, pointed out also that in order for a literary work to become comprehensible, the reader needs to discover himself and conceptualize the incorporated meanings. Gradually, the opinion that the aesthetic experience is cognitively significant was supported by theoretical approaches and research that were realized in the fields of psychology and pedagogy. Moreover, we must say that the comprehension of each work of art is susceptible to multiple interpretations that are not mutually exclusive but can bring about with their interactions an enrichment to the whole approach. If to all the above we add the fact that artworks offer intensives to comprehend their social and cultural frame, it seems valid to state that any educational program should include in its central objectives the development of reflection through aesthetic experience. So you can see also here, you can read it, that there are 3 trends of aesthetic experience. The first trend poses multiple mass culture works as observation objects in order to critically examine the stereotyped message they contain. The second trend context, works of art are used here, and there is a third trend that tries to combine critical reflections with the aesthetic experience, infusing the learning process with frequent use of art masterpiece. But however, we should note that in the literature there are very few references on this kind of approach. So from my experience, I realized that during the implementation of this method, the function of critical thinking through art leads to an important transformation of people's thinking, destabilizing fixed ideas and existing identities. It also helps to discover new ways of seeing, of hearing, of thinking, of feeling as well as of experiencing our communities, our neighbors, our societies. On the subject of stereotypes that lead to fascism, violence, racism, and extremism, the topics discussed with the students were often related with religious tolerance, the respect for human rights, gender equality, freedom of speech, how nation and race are defined, but also what it means to be a citizen and which are its responsibilities and duties within the society. So I think that the outcome was that we need to strengthen social bonds between all groups of the population, starting with young pupils and students, in order to secure social cohesion, fight anti-Semitism and fascism, violent extremism and prejudice. For this purpose, I think that higher education is of great importance, as through research and cooperation on the European and international levels, we could create the appropriate educational tools in order to encounter social stereotypes that break social cohesion and drive especially young people towards violent and extremist movements undermining the principles of citizenship and democratic values. Through education, we could also discuss the possibilities to unite people regardless of their differences, racial, social, cultural, religious. Education may not be able to answer every problem of contemporary societies, of course. It is, however, the most powerful weapon in order to change the world, as Nelson Mandela used to say. Thank you very much for your patience.
I'm Susan Shepler here at American University in the School of International Service, but I feel like I'm sort of a School of Education person too. I'd like to thank Cynthia for the invitation to participate today, and especially the freedom to speak somewhat speculatively. In her instructions to us, she said this shouldn't be a presentation of a finished research paper, so it's not. I'd also like to thank the other panelists and all of you for coming and for your attention and for what I hope will be a very productive exchange later on. I'm also thankful to Heidi for already introducing the idea that education can both contribute to and counter violent extremism, right? So that's something that we need to get on the table from the very beginning. I want to introduce myself and my research interests to start and then go into what I want to talk about. I've been working in West Africa since 1987 when I went as a Peace Corps volunteer. I see other RPCVs in the audience, hello. So that's 27 years or something. And I have since researched and written about a range of issues related to, in West Africa, a range of issues related to youth and children, education, both formal and informal, the state, especially young people's relationship to the state, their expectations of the state, and armed conflict. So in particular, I've worked mostly in Sierra Leone, Liberia, but recently in Nigeria as well. And so I'll be talking more about Nigeria as we get on, especially Boko Haram, which is what you think about when you think about education and violent extremism in West Africa. But I've worked on, for example, reintegration of former child soldiers, which you can think of as an application of education to de-radicalize young people. I've worked on the training of refugee teachers in Guinea. I've done recently some participatory research with communities on education in rural Sierra Leone. And I've done some interviews on education and transitional justice in, there's Lily Cole, hi. In Sierra Leone and Liberia as well. So basically my whole career, I think I've been circling around this issue by looking at things that are youth, education, the state, violence, coming at it from lots of different perspectives. And so I'm at a stage in my career now where I think I'm trying to integrate all of this and figure out what my take is. So thank you for the invitation to try to fumble towards that. And what informs my perspective is my training sort of in critical theory related to education about schooling itself. That for me, education is not the same thing as schooling. Schooling is a particular institution, and certainly in the context where I work, it's a colonial institution. that has its own particular historical meanings and its own particular relationship to the state, the colonial state and then the post-colonial state as well. So I always want to start by separating the institution of schooling and its relationship to the state from learning, which is something that is omnipresent in everyday life and that happens everywhere. And when we say education, we tend to mean schooling here in a Western context, but I want to be very careful to sort of separate those two. I think it's very important. Because for us, we really privilege schools as the sites of learning. It's hard for us to think about learning that's happening in sites that are outside of schools. But I think it's really important if we want to think about schools as places to either combat violent extremism or schools as places that contribute to violent extremism. So as I said, most recently I was in Nigeria, basically all of last academic year, as a Fulbright scholar. And I was located at the University of Jos. Jos is sort of right in the center of Nigeria, and it's a town that's experienced interreligious conflict since 2001. Christian-Muslim violence in several waves. And so they have at that university a center on conflict management and peace studies. So that's where I was affiliated to both teach courses there to Nigerian students, but also to do some research. And the research that I set out to do was about this connection between education, the state, and armed conflict. And it was really motivated in many ways by the phenomenon of Boko Haram. So those of you who don't know, Boko Haram means something like Western education is a sin. Western education is haram. And so you see a very clear rejection of Western education by a group of very violent extremists. And so what this did for me was open up a puzzle based in West Africa, because my previous work in Sierra Leone had also had violent activities, but in Sierra Leone's case, it was violence. Mark Ginsburg. For shame. Oh, tell them I said hi. In Sierra Leone, they had a war, and one of the causes of that war was young people's violent demand for access to education. So for me, this set up sort of a puzzle, the kind of puzzle that researchers always like, that within one region and two countries with pretty similar colonial and post-colonial histories, in one case you see violent rebellion sort of for education, in one case violent rebellion against education. And so what is it about education in this context that gets people so violent? And so that's what I hope to study. And I think that working in West African schools has really revealed to me a lot of the ways in which schools function as particular cultural institutions in these settings and not as the way that we sort of imagine that schools should operate. I think we have an ideology about education, which is that school is always good, school just contributes to the good without ever really thinking about, well, what do schools look like in different settings? What do they do in different settings? And so I'm very much interested in the disjuncture between kind of Western ideologies of education, especially with respect to youth. Pretty much that's what we think should happen for youth all the time, education, 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 and the actual practice of education on the West African ground. I think we, but when I say we, I mean we in the West, we at UNICEF, we at USAID, I don't know, we professors, we see a problem of youth, and we tend to naturally see education as the solution. And there's a long history to that, right? We tend to see schooling as the natural place to turn for problems of youth. But I want to interrogate that a little bit and ask, what does education mean in each of these various West African contexts, right? Why are there violent rebellions in opposite directions around education in Nigeria and Sierra Leone? And just to say, I'm also hoping to write about Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire in this mix as well, because each one of these West African countries has its own interesting relationship between education and conflict. And Cote d'Ivoire, for example, there's a lot of xenophobia and the movement of equalite, and education was a site for the production of that xenophobia as well. Another thing to throw into this mix is this phenomenon of the educated unemployed. That is, people who are educated but can't find jobs, the jobs that they were promised, right? They were promised that if they got educated, they would have jobs. In some ways, those are the people who are behind the violent extremism to an even greater extent than the uneducated. So that's another thing that I think throws us back on our heels when we think of schooling as sort of the solution to the problems of youth. That for some youth, schooling was not a solution for them. Schooling, the frustration of having endured schooling and then not getting the job at the end of the day, it's that frustration that actually drives them towards violent extremism. And we see that people have written about that in the Arab Awakening or the Arab Spring, whatever we're calling it. And I certainly also saw that in Nigeria as a huge factor of educated Nigerians who did not get the jobs in the government that they were promised. Nigeria in particular, pretty much the whole state runs on oil money, and the thing everybody wants is a job in the government to get some of that oil money, and education is the only way to get that. I mean, connections is really the only way to get that, but education is sort of something that you also have to do. So a lot of educated people who are very frustrated that they're not getting their share of the oil pie. Oil what? Oil barrel, the oil, what do you call, anyway. So while I was there, for example, there was a riot because one of the ministries announced a bunch of jobs and sort of asked Nigerian young people to come to stadiums in numerous cities around Nigeria and to sort of line up and fill out the forms for this number of jobs. And, 10,000 people would show up for 100 jobs, something like that. And in a couple of stadiums, that day when they did this, there were sort of stampedes and people were actually killed in these, groups of educated unemployed. So that very palpable frustration. And so now I want to turn towards Boko Haram itself, and you can see that this is the sort of set of people that they can very easily recruit from. I jumped forward. I'll skip over that. I think that Boko Haram, we've tended to think of it as part of a larger kind of, they recently said they wanted to join ISIS, right? That it's part of a larger clash of civilizations, a part of a broader Islamic jihadism in the Sahel. But I think for those people who actually study this in Nigeria, it's really about the Nigerian state. It's about people reacting to their place within the Nigerian state, more than it is about kind of transnational Islamism. People have now certainly taken advantage of that transnational Islamism is in the air, but at its core, it's really about people's relationship to their own Nigerian state and their place with respect to that state. And again, Cynthia said we could be speculative and not necessarily provide evidence for this, but this is what I firmly believe. And that the reason it's called Boko Haram is that their rejection of the state and their place in the state, education sort of stands in as representative of the state. Education is the thing in their lives that they see as corrupt and a lie, and they were promised something and didn't get it, right? And so this is why Boko Haram has attacked schools, attacked students and teachers. They've also attacked police stations because police have kind of rounded them up and treated them very badly. Soldiers have treated them badly. But I think it's so important that the school becomes a site of rebellion, right? That the anger at the school, and that the famous case of the girls that they kidnapped, the Chibok girls, that was again at a school, right? So it's fascinating to me how the school becomes part of their rejection of their place within the Nigerian state. And they're not rejecting technology. They're posting their things on YouTube. So it's you can't just cast it as a kind of backwards movement, and what they need is sort of a modernizing education. It's so much more complex than that. I also wanted to say a couple more things. I I think that this line of inquiry, this incomplete line of inquiry, really leads us to see that we can no longer sort of take education as a panacea, that you can't just say more education will lead to better outcomes. And I think even recent attempts to sort of refocus our attention from just the simple provision of quantity of education with goals like education for all, towards the quality of education. I think in the last few years we've sort of seen a shift towards, education for all, but it needs to be good education. Otherwise we're just kind of making kids go sit in classrooms with bad teachers. I think that even this shift towards quality of education is still really only one definition of quality, along which sort of education can move up or down a scale. It's still got one particular sense of what schooling should look like, right? And so I think that what is needed is really work on understanding what education or what learning looks like in these multiple different contexts. And that means understanding and respecting the Islamic education that's already there on the ground. And in fact, in Nigeria, Southern Nigerians are sort of afraid of Islamic education. They're afraid of the al-Majri phenomenon, which are sort of young boys who learn the Quran and move around with itinerant imams. And that I think what we actually need to do, instead of sort of impose ideas about what quality education should look like, we should really try to understand existing sort of educational activities, even if they don't look like school, on the ground. And we, again, need to figure out ways to work with that. And I think that that can mean working with youth popular culture, working with youth peace builders of various kinds. While I was there, I had lots of great examples of young people in peace clubs, and I'm going to take one more minute, sorry. And especially like Muslim and Christian girls who work together in groups where they got to know each other. So I think there is something to be done with these young people around peace. But at the end of the day, I think it's really the state that is responsible. I think, as our earlier speaker said, we can't expect education to do everything, that these are really political issues. Finally, in my last minute that I'm over, Cynthia asked us to answer two questions. One, what was the most pressing issue or challenge? And two, what do universities need to do? So very quickly, I think the most pressing issue or challenge is the need to really take apart these ideologically driven models of education, because I think they get in our way. And I think we need to broaden our perspectives and truly work with local actors, local models of what education can look like. Two, what do universities need to do? I mean, I'm an anthropologist on a panel full of sociologists, but I think that we need to teach anthropology. Universities need to teach in a way that respects other cultures, and they need to teach ethnography as a methodology that allows understanding other cultures. I think it also means kind of participatory research, participatory design, monitoring, and evaluation. And just to end, finally, as I said, these are political distinctions. We too often kind of turn combating violent extremism into a technical thing that we render it technical by saying if we just get the curriculum right, if we just get the teachers' training right. But I think we also can't lose sight of the fact that these are political interventions. Thank you.